Hello and very warm welcome to the Rise interview, 60 minutes of multifaceted discussions where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And we feature the voices at the heart of the stories. I am Christian Obodo. Thanks for joining us. Coming up in the next hour, a wave of crisis threatening the Middle East is causing great tension in the region. And as promised, Iran struck back at the United States for killing Revolutionary Guard commander, firing several ballistic missiles at two military bases in Iraq that houses American troops in a major escalation between the two longtime foes. Iran's retaliation has caused oil prices to spike and move higher, global uncertainty, and poses a great challenge for U.S. President Donald Trump. We'll discuss the wider implication of this recent attack by Iran on the U.S. with our top-notch analysts in a moment. And hours after the remains of General Qasem Soleimani were returned to his hometown in Iran for burial, Iran carried out a ballistic missile attack on air bases housing U.S. forces in Iraq in retaliation for the U.S. killing of General Qasem Soleimani. Iran's President Hassan Rouhani wrote on Twitter that General Qasem Soleimani fought heroically against a number of jihadist groups and that Europe was safer because of his efforts. Iran said the attack on U.S. bases in Iraq was self-defense and denied seeking to escalate the situation into a war, although the country's supreme leader described the attack as a slap against America's military presence in the region. It is Iran's most direct and audacious assault on America since the 1979 seizing of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran.
Well, last night we slapped them. These military actions are not enough. What is important is that the corrupt presence of America in this region comes to an end.
دست سلیمانی عزیز ما را اونها قطع کردند.
They cut off the hands of our dear Soleimani, and you saw his revered hand near his body in videos and pictures. The revenge for that is to force America out of this region. The real revenge and the ultimate response by regional nations is when America is expelled from this region and its hands of aggression is cut off forever.
Last night, tens of domestically built missiles, or domestic short-range missiles, were used due to the distance for the targets, and for the first time since World War II, an important American base which they said they had spent a lot of money on was hit. They knew that our revenge was coming, so they had made some preparations. Of course, those preparations didn't help them stop the missiles from hitting the targets, but they had certainly taken measures to prevent casualties. We need some time to see what has happened there.
Well, for more on this, I've now been joined by the international journalist and African affairs analyst, Lindsay Barrett, and by our Rise News correspondent and analyst as well, Carl Bostic. Gentlemen, very warm welcome to the Rise interview. It's not the best of time in world politics. U.S. and Iran putting or setting the Middle East on fire. Lindsay, what does this portend for the world geopolitics, economics, and the others?
Well, it's not surprising. Donald Trump has made it plain, right from before he became president, that his own approach to world affairs is to cause confusion. He has a theory that chaos is what you survive in, especially if you don't really know what you are doing. And he's been very consistent. To take, to give an example or to say why I think this is so, it's coming at the beginning of an election year in which he has been impeached by his own Congress. He took that extraordinary step of killing a major official. Don't fool yourself. This is like killing the Minister of Defense of a country in which everybody knows you have a problem with, but the country also has a problem with you. And if you negotiate to settle the problem, that is much better than exaggerating the crisis. But it's an election year, so I'm not surprised.
You think it needs to create the chaos, like you said, this kind of crisis, international one, for his rating to go up? He's doing very well domestically in terms of, creating new jobs for the American people.
I think very unfortunate, it may seem frivolous, but then frivolity is not ever far away from anything Donald Trump does. But what I think he has done is changed the narrative that the new year was bringing for his presidency. It's unfortunate because the consequence could be very dire for innocent lives. However, I believe he may be playing the game of, I have so much power that every intelligent person will be afraid of challenging me. So this may be, we're still waiting to see where it is going.
All right.
But I'm not surprised.
Okay. Carl, domestically, Trump is said to be doing great, with the economy, creating thousands of jobs every month or quarterly. But internationally, he's taking every corner of the globe. Do you see Trump and the U.S. getting out of this very well?
The problem, Christian, is that, his closest allies, his partners, historical ones, they're just as confused as he's referring himself. So in other words, none of the EU or NATO partners had any advance warning as well. The reason why that's important is that in the end, there's going to be a bit of support diplomatically and military that will be required, burden sharing, so to speak. In other words, you already have a situation where coalition troops that are in Iraq, that are there to assist the Iraqi government in ferreting out those last remaining pockets of ISIS. You have coalition forces working with the U.S. that are now rethinking the value of their presence there in Iraq, in part because they're relying on U.S. troops for cover. You've got about 6,000 U.S. troops in Iraq right now. That's their mission, whereas you have hundreds of more NATO troops as well. But those NATO troops are saying, how can we stay here any longer if we are now exposed, if the Americans are now staying in their barracks because they cannot go out on missions, so to speak?
So the killing of General Qasem Soleimani is a big mistake Donald Trump has made, America has made.
No one's going to say it's a mistake, because if they have to choose between whether or not this killing was justified or not, they're going to try to split the hair or thread the needle if they can. And by that I'm saying that no one's denying that this person was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans during the Iraq War and many thousands more in Syria by the backing up of the Syrian regime of
al-Bashir.
Al-Bashir, absolutely that. But what they're also saying, did that warrant this particular killing, which in the eyes of Iran and other countries, for example Russia, is tantamount to an assassination. As he mentioned, this is like killing the Minister of Defense. He's the second most powerful person. So what I'm saying is this, Christian. I'm saying that they want to admit that there's no disagreement about how bad or borderline evil he was, but it was the wisdom behind this. Because one criticism is that there was no thinking in terms of what's the second, third, and fourth order of decision making behind this. In other words, what's the strategy? Just because you know where he is, does that mean you should take him out? When they've been following him for the past X number of years, so to speak. Because what this is doing, it's throwing everyone in disarray. Israel is on the radar. It's always been on the radar. And all of them are being very, very tight-lipped, very, very, circumspect. That's why it's important to see what comes out this morning when President Trump does speak, because if anything, people are now saying that in the wake of last night's strike, it actually, ironically, is providing a possible off-ramp. That means a way to get out of this possible chaos from both sides, because at the end of the day, Christian, really neither side wants an all-out war. But from where Donald Trump comes from, he comes from, a place where it's all about claiming a win. It's a win if he can say, we took out this bad guy. And it's a win if we can say, see, I proved the liberals wrong. I proved the Democrats wrong, that we're not going into all-out war. But this opening salvo, as you also were saying, it's not necessarily the end. As Ayatollah said, it's a slap in the face. And as the Islamic Revolutionary Guard said in one of their messages on the app Telegram, that's the app, they were saying that this is the beginning of the revenge. And so even though, the final point is this, even though you got the Iraqi foreign minister saying that this concludes our response, that's not to say that Iran doesn't have all these other proxies out there that are inspired to do whatever they want to do. That gives Iran plausible deniability.
All right. Lindsay, the downing, just less than some hours ago, the downing of the Ukrainian jetliner with 174 passengers, though aviation investigation is yet to be carried out. Iran has said they are not going to release the black box. Are you pointing fingers at the direction of Iran?
Once again, you see the kind of destabilization that has entered the issue. Hardly anyone believes that something didn't happen that should not have happened, and that this is not simply an aviation accident. It may be, but right now, anything like that happens in the Middle East, people have different concepts, and people will think of other possibilities. In other words, the whole region has been destabilized. The whole life of the Middle East is upside down. And as he rightly said, don't forget Israel. Israel may be blustery and saying, we follow America, but don't forget
Can they be easily dragged into this?
They can be. Not only can they be dragged into it, they now have to be very careful in some of their actions, because they could provoke proxy action that Iran may deny, but which would create a new war, an entirely new war situation.
Well, the irony is they don't even have to say anything to be a target, because just by being Israel, they're a target as far as Hezbollah is concerned.
They were the original target.
They've always been a target. I mean, I think what's new and interesting is that if Iran does completely walk away from the nuclear accord, I mean, Israel has made no bones about it. They've made no secret of the fact that if we're convinced that Iran once again is embarking on a path towards building its first nuclear bomb, we would not hesitate to strike, to take action. And the U.S. has said the same. And that's a whole nother cycle of violence and possible regional war.
Gentlemen, I want us to look at emerging powers. Russia is still a world power. China is an emerging power. Turkey sits between Asia and Europe and plays a decisive role too in NATO, even though it's still being kept at bay somewhat. How do you think these other blocs are going to see to the developing escalation of war or near war?
Russia made its point in Syria and continues to make its point in Syria. Turkey is defending a principle by saying it has the right to intervene in quarrels around it, around the region, and especially around the border. Now, Mr. Trump's actions have escalated probably the worries of these other powers. And so I think they will have something to say very soon. But I don't see Russia openly taking the side of Iran unless Iran itself is hit. And what could come out of that?
But we saw that during the Gulf War, when the coalition forces, Russia was of course supplying its Scud missiles to
That's what I'm
Iraq.
saying.
Then, yeah.
If
there's a direct hit,
if there's a direct hit, their capabilities may suddenly improve with help from Russia. But as of now,
yeah,
what we're seeing, as he rightly said, is the possibility of a way out.
Okay.
Especially since this recent hit that has had absolutely no effect.
Carl, you don't have any doubt that this situation, could draw the likes of China into this ongoing proxy war so far, because China may really want to show its own military might to the world, apart from its economic El Dorado.
Well, it's not really in China's interest either, nor Russia's, as he was speaking about. Don't forget, both China and Russia, they're signatories to that Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It's a mouthful, JCPOA. That's the nuclear deal that was signed in 2015. So both China and Russia have taken the same stance in saying that this striking or killing of Qasem Soleimani is tantamount to almost a state of war, a political assassination. So they're definitely against that. But equally important, both of those countries want to constrain Iran. They don't want Iran to resume, pursuing a path of nuclear development, installing more centrifuges, enriching its uranium. So, if anything, China actually favors a diplomatic role right now. But in terms of Russia, going back to what he's talking about, I think we should watch what comes out of the meeting this weekend when Germany's Angela Merkel visits Moscow to see Vladimir Putin, because those two countries have both volunteered to help mediate a conflict. And it's definitely important in the interest of Russia for a number of reasons. One, Russia and Germany, besides being signatories to this nuclear deal, Russia is also a permanent member of the UN Security Council. So that could be another forum that this could be played out on. And then another matter to point out about Russia, of course, you mentioned how Russia supplied Scud missiles to Iran. Yes, they do have a relationship, and nowhere is it more actively seen than what you have going on in Syria. Because if not for the role and participation of both Russia and Iran, you would not have the regime of Assad even standing right now, if not with the support. So for its own, shall we say, cynical reasons, Russia does not want to see Iran bogged down or consumed by a war. Because if it is drawn down and consumed by a war, that puts a greater burden on Russia to maintain and support Syria. So that's one reason they don't want to see Iran tied down, for its own mercantile type reasons.
Okay. Lindsay, you are an international journalist and a public affairs analyst. The United Nations, would you say they've been slow, the UN, the EU, have they been slow in quickly mediating this situation?
They're in the worst position of anybody, because one, they were taken completely by surprise. Why, I don't know. As I said at the beginning, I'm not surprised. I expected something like this from Trump. But other people apparently gave him the benefit of the doubt. And the United Nations reflects that, the belief that common sense would prevail. And they've been wrong-footed. He's mentioned Russia and China are members of the permanent members of the Security Council. But you know what happens in the Security Council. They take a position, but take no action. This is what we are going to see for some time, until mainly the European allies of Mr. Trump are able to bring something that the UN can deliberate upon. They need a policy, they need a strategic objective that the UN can manage. And that is what may come out of any negotiations that follow now. Or who knows?
And what would be the implications if, as the Iraqi National Assembly is supposed to pass a resolution that the U.S. Forces remaining in Iraq should evacuate? What are the consequences?
Well, the immediate consequences are that it creates a security vacuum if they pull out, and because then they would be closely followed by all foreign coalition forces.
Will it give Iran room to really,
Not only would it give Iran room, but the immediate winner or victor could be ISIS as well, because that will allow them the ability to reconstitute and regroup themselves. And one of the reasons why they're a diminished and spent force right now, because you have like the 24/7 air cover of U.S. aircraft providing surveillance as Iraqi troops hunt down these ISIS pockets,
the remnants of the ISIS.
Of it, but they could easily reconstitute, regroup. But going back to what you're saying, Christian, that's why it's just so confusing, because that vote we saw on Sunday, it was a vote of 170 to 0 in favor of expelling, or shall we say, just bluntly evicting them. That said, that was not the full parliament, Christian. The full parliament is 328 members. You had a boycott of Sunni and Kurdish members who did not turn up to vote. And if they had turned up to vote, it would be to vote against that resolution, to have them stay. Because as emotional as Iraqis are about what happened to Soleimani on their own foreign soil, you still have it's a divided country. They think that the U.S. is a stabilizing force. But I should also say this, Christian, which is, quote, why it's confusing. First of all, Abdul al-Mahdi, the prime minister, he's a caretaker prime minister. He resigned in November because of mounting protests in the country about government mismanagement.
Thousands of lives.
And the parliament failed to find or choose a new prime minister mid-December. So in short, that has no binding effect at all, because the parliament does not have an acting prime minister.
There's a vacuum.
Chosen. There's a vacuum there, number one. But number two, more interesting, and this is a real fine point, no law was passed or bill that called for the presence of U.S. troops, Christian. What that means is this: it was an executive to executive order between the heads of both governments to allow for U.S. troops to visit, where if I don't want your troops to stay in my territory anymore, I just simply send you a letter and I can sign it, and that's it. So that's all it would take to revoke it. The problem is there is no newly chosen prime minister at all. That's the confusion right there. They need a new prime minister, they need a new government, and that's why you have the response that you had from officials like Secretary of State Pompeo and Defense Secretary Esper saying, well, this is all good and well that they held this vote, but it means nothing because it's a caretaker government. But that said, what the implications are is you have a security vacuum. In fact, at the end of the day, no matter what happens with that strike last night, even if it's an opening salvo, and as Ayatollah himself did say, their end game is the eviction of all foreign troops from Iraq. And that's the step in that direction. So that's why this could still unfold in many, many violent ways.
But would that not be, Lindsay, and interlopers' comment from Iran to be asking that foreign troops leave Iraq?
Well,
what's their own interest?
You know, I keep saying that. Let us not forget, this is a regional crisis. It's not a crisis between Iran and Iraq.
Yeah.
It's the whole
Mid-East crisis.
Unstable Middle East that is at stake. In fact, I was saying something before that the problem is actually Israel's problem, because whatever happens is going to either make Israel safer or less safe.
Yeah.
You know, and that is a very grave danger. That's why I don't think anybody will be able to persuade America to get out of the Middle East. We talk now, they are there because they're protecting their major interest, which in the end is Israel. Now, what I think Iran may be able to accept is, after a lot of discussion, the agreement that the Americans who stay or the foreign troops who stay are targeting insurgent movements other than their own proxy
war.
because they actually worked very well with Soleimani when we were fighting the
exactly
ISIS,
what, yeah, exactly
you know.
what.
So there has to be a change of objective, a change of strategy, and I think at the end of this year, American troops will still be there, but as he rightly said, it will be a new agreement between two presidents.
So this must be a big, big miscalculation then. I want us to look at the danger of an unstable Middle East. Can that scenario dovetail into Africa too? Is this situation capable of affecting the African continent, Carl?
I cannot speak to it in great detail, but what I can tell you is this, Christian. I think what makes Iran so potent, so dangerous, because we are now in a century where it's no longer a century of conventional wars, where it's boots on the ground. Wars are now being fought by different means. They're being fought through modes of terrorism. They're being fought through modes of cyber attacks. It's how you have through proxies. Those are the shadow wars, and that's how Iran has projected its strength. So while it does have those proxies in the Middle East, from Syria to Lebanon with Hezbollah, to Yemen with the Houthis, to Gaza with Islamic Jihad, at the same time, yes, it does have proxies. It does have a presence, perhaps not as strong as in the Middle East, but in West Africa, for example. For that matter, also in Latin America, the biggest terrorist attack against Jewish people was in Buenos Aires, Argentina, where the biggest synagogue was blown up through Hezbollah proxies. Now, the thing to keep in mind about Africa is this, and I'm sure you can elaborate much more greater detail, Christian. As you know, it was only just days ago we had an attack in Kenya. Mm-hmm. We had an attack in Kenya at an American base where a few Americans were killed by al-Shabaab. Now, we're not saying al-Shabaab is a proxy of Iran, because it's just the opposite. Because al-Shabaab, those are Sunni Muslims. Iran is a Shiite Muslim country. I mean, that's a fine detail, but it's an important difference. But what it does say is this. It says that if you can attack an outpost like this in Kenya, for example, it exposes the vulnerability of U.S. positions in Africa. So it doesn't have to be a proxy for this kind of attack to happen. You can still have these kinds of attacks where there's a vulnerability. And the other thing is this. Even though you've got the Iranian foreign minister, Javad Zarif, saying that we have concluded our proportional response. The danger of Iran's potency is that even though they may have concluded their direct tit-for-tat response, that doesn't mean they've closed the door on how proxies will respond. You've got Hezbollah saying, we will still respond in our own way. You've got the militias in Iraq saying, we will now atone for the death of our own martyr. That was Mahdi al-Muhannas, who was a part of that convoy, and he was, quite frankly, incinerated. So what I'm suggesting is that it's not the end, because you have proxies out there, and I'm sure you can speak to greater detail of just how volatile it is here also in Africa.
The volatility in Africa, we're, just like you said, we're beginning to see
it's contagious.
Yes.
It's fertile ground. It's fertile ground.
You know, this kind of instability spreads easily
like a virus.
In Africa.
Like a virus.
Because
we've seen the Shiites in Nigeria.
Yes, and already Africa
holding public demonstrations.
Has the disadvantage of weak, sometimes unstable, sometimes directionless governance. Just watch what is happening in Mali and Central African Republic. Already, we're having problems keeping those places stable. If something like what is happening in the Middle East becomes more volatile.
Religion becomes tempestuous.
And the problem in this modern age is that it spreads across borders so
very
swiftly.
quickly.
It's transnational.
You see, so that is the danger. That's why we should not simply sit back and say it's happening over there. We should be, our governments should, especially our regional bodies like ECOWAS, should begin to talk about how to isolate ourselves from the crises that occur elsewhere. we have to be careful.
Carl, how is that possible to isolate Africa, to isolate itself from the crisis in the Middle East? One, oil politics would come to play. So you're looking at a dependent economy of most African countries that are oil producers and the rest.
You know, that's been the criticism of U.S. foreign policy, at least the past few years under this administration, where everything is really measured in terms of, the size of forces and boots on the ground. You've got, 7,000 U.S. troops in Africa right now. The main base is Djibouti, with 4,000 there. There was one interesting statistic that came out, Christian, which I found almost startling. For every civilian analyst of African foreign policy in the U.S., in terms of the State Department and such, there are seven soldiers. As though, in other words, the ratio is heavily weighted towards military. And that's to say that the way in which to really coordinate and keep people on board and supportive is not necessarily to have that military component where you're countering terrorism, but that's where you need really aid and development and humanitarian assistance to reduce poverty, to improve governance, to eliminate corruption, those kinds of things. And that's how you also really fight those roots of terrorism, because the terrorism is really exploiting those gaps of livelihoods of people who feel, quite frankly, that they're just forgotten by their own countries, their own governments. That's what makes them, vulnerable and susceptible. Those are vulnerable people. That's what's saying.
So what would economists like in Nigeria be saying now? The oil price is spiking, rising to $70 for our finest crude, which is probably the finest in the world. More money.
There's an unfortunate thing I have to tell you about this that nobody seems to remember. When we buy oil at 70, or we sell oil at $70,
we now buy the
refined product, because we don't refine our oil. So
it's still going to go up.
So when we destabilize economies outside, we destroy ours. We have seen it happen. A few people.
Well, during the Gulf War, yes, Nigeria had a windfall that
we had a windfall, but
has not even been accounted for, over $2.8 billion.
So these, please don't let me remember that.
And then also, Christian,
can anybody ever forget that?
Christian, you're right about that in terms, the fact that if you're not refining it, that's an extra cost then that you have to kind of factor in. But then the other part is that nonetheless, for the profits that are being made, from extracting it from the ground and then selling it for refining, that oil wealth is still not maybe being distributed in an equitable way. I mean, that's why you had what you had with the Agonis, I believe, back in the 90s with their
the
protests.
Niger Delta agitations generally.
And you had a complete destruction of the environment and oil spillage and such, and no compensation. But one of the main complaints was that you've been mining our countryside. You've been destroying our environment, and we have nothing to show for our own livelihoods. So if the prices are skyrocketing, then where is the distribution of that wealth? And that's a policy problem for the government.
And it's another problem that will breed the kind of insurgent or insurgency that was...
The discontent that they'll feed on, absolutely.
And let's look at the Middle East economy to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the rest. How far ahead would these countries be, particularly at a time that Saudi Arabia has floated on the international stock market, its national oil corporation?
Well, again, interestingly enough, what Saudi Arabia is trying to do, they actually are trying to wean themselves and diversify themselves away from their oil reserves, because already with the Strait of Hormuz, you have 1/3 of the global supply or the global production of oil passing through that narrow Strait of Hormuz, which Iran can really close at will if they want to. And I think they're always tempted to, because of these sanctions. They can't export their own oil. They went from exporting 2 million barrels 2 million barrels a day, or 2 billion, to now just 220,000 barrels because of the sanctions. So in terms of countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and such, I think this puts more pressure on them to also diversify away from oil production. That said, they remain prime targets for Iran because of their alliances with the U.S., and that's what they're also concerned about. And that's why you have a situation where while they actually are celebrating the killing of Qasem Soleimani, they don't want to see this spiral any further because it could still really just all of a sudden cripple their production facilities. We saw a strike back in September, for example, and for a brief period of time, their production rate was halved automatically, instantly. They were able to rebound, but it was a warning, a threat to show just how easily Iran can strike from a missile launched from Iran's territory.
And that's why we're seeing the huge destabilization in between the Hutus and is it Yemen? Yeah, in Yemen.
The Houthis.
The Houthis.
Yes, well, one thing he has just reminded me is that when you talk of the Middle East, when you think of those who are the American allies, now what has happened so far is all happening on Iraqi soil. Iraq, as Carl pointed out, is a divided country, very deeply divided between the Shiites, who are probably pro-Iran, and then the Sunnis and the Kurds, who are not.
Who are pro-Saudi Arabia.
They are pro-Saudi. In fact, they are probably pro-American, just keeping it quiet for now. You know? So you have a situation in which the war that could come if Trump's actions get more erratic would be entirely in the Middle East. It's not going to appear anywhere in America. There are no missiles going to the U.S. America will be talking and spending its money, but the destruction of lives, economies, societies will be there. And let me just remind the world of one thing.
Very quickly.
Donald Trump says that he will be happy to hit cultural icons. These are the world's legacies. They don't belong to Iran.
Absolutely.
It's like saying you are angry with the president of Egypt, so you bomb the pyramids.
Yeah, the nuclear agreement was sealed after several years of discussion between Iran and the EU, together with the then U.S. President Obama. But no sooner, Donald Trump torpedoed it. Now this proxy crisis, Iran says it's going to pull out of that nuclear agreement. What's the implication of this on
Well, if it really pulls out, the implications are very dire, because I'm pretty sure that Israel, especially if Netanyahu succeeds in establishing a government, will be targeting Iranian nuclear
reactors and sites
in any event, especially if this crisis deteriorates. And the Iranians are fully aware of this. They know that it is possible. So I think the threat to pull out is aimed at asking the EU members and also Russia and China to put pressure
on the
US to come back to the table at some point. And out of this crisis, that may be possible. It may be one of the ways out, to go back to a negotiation to get a nuclear non-proliferation agreement on the table.
Yeah, Carl, there is an agreement already, and Trump is not foreclosing the possibility of dialogue with the Iranian government on this.
Well, that's what's so interesting, Christian, because you may remember back in September when you had the General Assembly meeting, there were actually back-channel attempts led by France's Emmanuel Macron to have Iran's President Rouhani and Trump actually meet on the sidelines of the General Assembly just for those kinds of purposes. So, this is, Donald Trump, who's always, fashioned himself, as the master deal maker, who can solve everything from the nuclear crisis in North Korea to peace in the Middle East and now to Iran. But the irony is, Christian, you're starting the new year with potentially 2 nuclear crises. I mean, the North Koreans have started their warning of a new test of their ballistic or even ICBM in the time to come as their surprise for the new year. We're waiting to see about that. But in terms of what's happening with Iran, the door is still open for diplomacy, but as he rightly says, it's really in the hands of the Europeans, because what they want to see happen, what Iran has done in a very artful way is this. They say, we no longer respect our requirements to abide by the JCPOA. However, that doesn't mean that we're closing the door. And what that means is this. For example, one of the key components of verification, making sure that they're not pursuing nuclear development, is to allow IAEA inspectors there in an unfettered sense, without asking, almost on a daily basis. They have not shut the door to IAEA inspectors, which is very, very crucial, very important. However, at the same time, they're saying, we now reserve the right to install more centrifuges. And if they can install centrifuges, that can accelerate the pace of their development. In other words, it's all about enriching the uranium to a high enough percentage so that it becomes a bomb-grade material. North Korea already has dozens of that bomb-grade material. Iran has yet to have its first nuclear bomb. So where they're at right now is about 5% enrichment, Christian. If they get to 20%, and that's what everyone worried about. And this was so ironic, Christian. The way that JCPOA or nuclear deal was structured was basically, it was about hitting the pause button for 15 years. And that's one of the things that candidate Donald Trump was complaining about. Says, why should we give Iran a break for 15 years and remove sanctions where they can now make a lot of money and plow back into their ballistic missile development and plow back into their economy and do the nefarious things they do? We've given them a 15-year green light. Well, guess what, Christian? This JCPOA has only been in active action for only 5 years. And now it's already over. So what could have been a 15-year pause is now already finished in 5 years. So it's really kind of backfired. If it was even a strategy, at best maybe it was only a tactic. Yeah. So there's that considered. So going back to the original question, though, the very fact that they're saying that, well, we can still have verification, that's a way of saying that we will still allow for European inspection because we do want to talk. But the point I want to make in terms of time span goes, when it comes to enrichment, apparently when it gets to 20%, it can then really accelerate the pace.
The capability is already there. Well, destructive capability or for good.
They call it the breakout phase. And what that breakout phase means, that's when the clock really starts, Christian, because within a year's time of hitting 20%, it has its first nuclear bomb. Yeah. That's what everyone's concerned about. So what happens when it reaches 20%? Is that when it's a 1-year countdown? And is that when we see military action by Israel or even the U.S.?
No wonder even the American President Donald Trump, who just finished addressing, a World Press Conference, first he talked about America. No American was armed in the missile attacks, and he says Iran appears to be standing down on the issue. So the same thing with the Senate's majority leader, Mitch McConnell, who is calling for some restraints. I think if we have that video, we can quickly just listen to what McConnell is saying.
We must remain vigilant in the face of serious threats posed by Tehran. Apparently, these strikes did not kill or wound Americans, but they demonstrate the significant progress Iran has made over the last decade in building a large, long-range, and accurate ballistic missile force. Many of us have long cited the absence of any constraint on Iran's sophisticated missile program as one of the primary shortcomings of the Obama-Iran deal. And this strike stands as a reminder to the world of this growing threat. I spoke to the President last night. I'm grateful for his patience and prudence as he and his cabinet deliberate how to respond appropriately to the latest Iranian provocation. As a superpower, we have the capacity to exercise restraint and to respond at a time and place of our choosing, if need be.
Lindsay, it looks as if some sense of reasoning is gradually coming to play in this.
As I tried to explain before, Donald Trump is a master of chaos, and he thrives in a chaotic situation. I figured, well, before I came here, I heard he was going, and I told my wife, Donald Trump is going to take the credit for the fact that no American died.
And for backing down. Carl, no surprise to you at all.
In terms of his...
Yeah.
Well, I think, you know, again, keep in mind, Christian, this is a leader who likes to be able to claim a victory, to claim a win. So he's been able to claim a win that we took out this bad guy who had a long history of doing lots of terrible, terrible things, you know, killing hundreds of Americans, killing thousands of Syrians, and maiming even thousands more. So we took out a bad guy. That's a win. The other one is one that he can kind of like really almost thumb his nose at his Democratic, quote unquote, liberal critics in the U.S. who said this leader is taking us down a path to war. And he's saying that, well, where's the war? They've already said that this concludes our proportional response. So it still may be the end of that proportional response, but it may only be the end of an episode, Christian, but the beginning of another to come, especially when you have other factions like the Islamic Revolutionary Guard saying that this is the beginning of the revenge. So as long as he can claim wins, that's great. But what does that say about a strategy for the Middle East? What does that say about de-escalation?
Yeah.
And that's the point. What does that say about a strategy to bring peace to the Middle East? What we're seeing is constant crisis.
And from even your submission earlier about America saying they're going to hit their cultural sites in Iran.
So if I don't like the Egyptian politics, I should go and bomb the pyramids. The so-called cultural sites of the Middle East are the beginning of civilization. They are global legacies. We should find ways to preserve, not destroy them.
Well, it's a war crime too. The UN Security Council resolution has declared, you know, the targeting of a cultural
historical
site as a war crime. And the irony is this, Christian, that resolution, which was passed in 2017, that was passed by the Security Council, and it was led by the U.S. So here's the U.S. leading a resolution for that.
It's going to do that. Well, Lindsay Barrett is an international journalist and analyst and writer, and Carl Bostic, a Rise News correspondent and analyst. And I forgot to say that Carl wears a mask, is one leg an American and British. Thanks so very much, gentlemen, for coming on the program.